good to be able to do things like this once in a while, to try to, particularly the recollection is nice. There were a lot of good things that happened over the years, things that I'll never forget. I don't know I ever went to this conference, but that really is where it all started. The exciting thing about being there was the potential that the Institute had for really making an impact on the state and local governments by doing research and trying to deal with some of the critical problems the state of Texas was faced with. And all of this was related to a general movement in this country to try to empower universities to bring their brain power to bear on some of the serious problems that the country was faced with, particularly urbanization and all of the difficulties spawned by it. And it was great to be a part of that. My name is David Tees, and I joined the staff of the Institute of Urban Studies in 1969. And my title at the time was Research Associate 1 or 2 or something like that. I stayed at the Institute, amazingly, for 40 years, doing a lot of different things that I had never expected to be doing.
Hey, my name is Paul Geisel. I came to UTA in 1970. I was the first faculty hire.
Jim Cornels. I first started working in what was then called the Institute of Urban Studies, and that was in 1970. I was one of 3 original faculty members, the other 2 being Paul Geisel and Del Table. And so we all started in 1970, and as I said, it was the Institute of Urban Studies. I came as an associate professor, and subsequently, a number of years later, was promoted full professor. I was not a chairman of a department because we didn't have official departments, but I was the head of the division. What we had were divisions one time for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, something like that. And then I was also the director of one of the graduate certificate programs during the latter years. Those were fairly recent programs, or were at the time I retired. And my total time with the university was 40 years.
My name is Linda Gordon. I started working for the Institute in 1971. I was hired by Dr. Edward S. Overman. I was hired on as a clerk, promoted to secretary. I was promoted to senior secretary, and I retired as an administrative secretary for the School of Urban and Public Affairs under the direction of Dr. Richard Cole.
All right, Sherman Wyman, and arrived in or about 1971. My position at the time was director of the Institute of Urban Studies, and I was at the associate rank.
My name is Art Anjumani. I was hired in UTA in 1979. However, I was hired at the School of Architecture because at that time, urban planning program had started a few years earlier.
Richard Cole, and I started in September 1980. I came as, then I was called director of the Institute, eventually to be called Dean of the School of Urban Public Affairs.
Del and I realized that we had to get this thing going, and so we found 15 students. Some of them Dr. Overman had found already, but we just got on the phone and called people, and they came. And so the very first semester we had a very small group. By the second semester we were up to 40, and within a year we had over 100. Because those 15 students, we told them, we're not sure we know what we're doing. And
when I was hired on, there was only one program, and that was the Urban Affairs program. And I think we had a total of 3 or 4 faculty members, not including the dean. And we only had a staff of 2 clerical workers and 1 administrative assistant.
When I first got there, my reaction was, what am I doing in academia? You know, I'd expected to be a city manager. I held the position of assistant city manager in Arlington and was prevailed upon by a member of the governor's staff at the time who had just been accepted a position as research director for this new Institute of Urban Studies. The Council of Governments had gotten a large grant, and the research director had been given responsibility for actually doing the research necessary on this grant. It was a manpower study for a 10-county region. And I found myself with a staff of 3 people working for me, which was very unusual. I'd never had that experience before. I had to actually supervise a small staff. So my first impression was, here's a little guy with big responsibility, which was quite a surprise.
Really kind of an open-ended start of a program which was conceived around the idea of what was happening in America at the time was a development of cities, major cities and metropolises, and it was singling out that as an entity of study, worthy of study itself, so that in bringing together an interdisciplinary team to look at that.
Well, it was a small group of well-knit older faculty. To remember them, specifically Jim Cornell's, Del Table, Paul Geisel, work, if you will, the core of the enterprise.
I thought that was a very friendly, harmonious environment. Very quickly we became friends with faculty and of course chairman Paul Geisel and Jim Cornell, and on the other side David Tees and Bob Wagner.
Yeah. A couple of things come to mind. Like any new dean or administrator, I guess, I spent a lot of my first several weeks and months there meeting with various stakeholders and trying to get a general view of what other people thought of the Institute. I was extremely impressed with the attitude that folks had and the impressions that they had of the faculty and the staff and the mission of the school or the Institute of Urban Studies, what it had accomplished already and its potential for what it would accomplish. You know, it had been there for, I don't know, 12 or 13 years by the time I arrived. So the Institute itself already had a history of sorts and was reasonably well known and had a variety of accomplishments. So the people that I talked to, from the alums to the administrators at UTA to city managers and city planners in the area, various public officials, senators, legislators, etc., was that they were all very impressed, not only with the potential that this institute had, but also with what it had already accomplished. That was one thing. The Institute had a second mission, not just outreach and service, as came with the Institute, but also had developed a couple of degree programs. So it had not only an outreach mission, it also had a more or less traditional academic mission of teaching students and scholarship and all that sort of thing. And as a result of that, I suppose, there were issues and questions about what was the best organizational structure that the Institute should develop in order to most efficiently and effectively accomplish its missions. And at that point in time, the school, or the Institute, had become fairly highly compartmentalized. We had then 3 divisions. Division Research and Service Division, which had its own budget, its own staff, its own mission, its own space in University Hall. We had the division that we called the Urban Affairs Division, I think, which had 5 or 6 faculty, and its mission, of course, was the Master of Arts degree in Urban Affairs. And we had the Criminal Justice Division. Its mission was to serve a large undergraduate criminal justice program as well as a small master's degree program. So what we had was an organizational structure that, as I say, was highly compartmentalized. Each of those divisions that I just mentioned had its own budget, its own staff, its own secretarial support, its own space defined on the floor. Rarely did the group meet together as a single group, but they met in individual programs. So it was a question as to whether or not this was the appropriate organizational structure for going forward. And I remember President Netterman was a very soft-spoken guy, and he rarely criticized anything. But I remember one time he said to me that he thought the Institute was overly organized, was the way that he put it, meaning that there was for a very small group of people with really a very small budget, the possibility that there would be better ways to organize. And so it was something that we had to work on. We worked on it that year. We worked on it for months and probably years to follow. But ultimately, we tried to create a more integrated group of people, whereas everybody participated in the academic mission, everybody had the opportunity to participate in the outreach mission, and that's how we went forward from that point on.
Certainly, initially, it was serving the needs of the cities and towns of Texas. We were almost totally focused on that opportunity, both in terms of the service outreach and in terms of the faculty and their teaching and their consulting. Let me tell you a little side story about how it looked in operation. I went over at the request of the city manager of Dallas, then George Schrader, to chat about an organization development program for the city, or at least for certain departments of the city of Dallas. And while I was there, saw Paul Geisel in the hall, who was meeting with a group of community activists downstairs, and then past a room where Del Table was meeting with members of the city council to discuss the possibility in those days of single-member districting.
We had a kind of a mission goal when we got here. The thing that the Institute had just finished writing, which is very fascinating, was kind of the state of Texas urban centers. It examined them from a political, social, and economic perspective. Things like representation of councils, all of those kinds of things were in that volume. And that became kind of our guide point. But one of the things that it pointed out, for example, was that there was not a single minority city manager or woman. And I said that we will change, that we are going to make a major change. So we could, with the students almost from the very beginning, imbue them with, here are the things, the challenges that are before us as urban people. We have to diversify our leadership. We have to train people to take over. And they bought it. We just had an awareness, and you could get it very quickly, that the efforts like the single-member district thing, I got Leadership Fort Worth organized, and we organized Leadership Arlington, Leadership Dallas, Leadership Grand Prairie, I think Leadership everywhere. And out of that, the whole notion of single-member districts came up as a way to reform the council districts. Dell came up with a game on how to design the districts. The computer systems weren't there yet. So we had precinct maps laid out, and they could do this with all of these forms and so forth, and they could do it. For the city of Fort Worth that passed, we got it on, and we did this. We went down to council, and they didn't want it. So they put it on the ballot. And Fort Worth passed single-member districts by less than 1%. So we won. But now the question mark was, who was going to draw the districts? So it turned out we trained citizens groups to do it. And we had 9 different plans. And I remember this really was a mess. And finally we brought all of those people, almost 200 people, came to TCU. And we sat down and said to each of them, what do you have to have? As it turned out, the plan that Dell and I had written was the plan. So the original single-member district here in Fort Worth was done by students and community leaders, but the Institute designed that. That was our mission. That was our kind of, Dell and I talked about that a lot, that we got great feeling out of the citizen process that it would work.
Well, two things come to my mind. One is the outreach program, which we've already talked about. And I guess, to remember that we were a legislatively created and mandated program, and that was unique to the state of Texas. We were created by a special act of the state legislature put at UTA for the purpose of engaging with the community, hopefully to address and hopefully to solve urban issues, and to bring the expertise and the talents that the university had to offer to get some of that out of the classroom directly into the community itself, to improve the community. So that was number one, I think. But the other defining feature of the school that occurs to me is, from the get-go, the interdisciplinary nature of the academic programs. And and most of that is credited to the very first director of the Institute, Edward Overman, who was hired from the University of Delaware to come, that had an established urban affairs program, to come and head up our then beginning master's degree in urban affairs. Overman was an urban historian. The first 3 people that he hired was an urban sociologist, an urban political scientist, and an urban economist. And his view was that the complex issues facing urban America and urban Texas, required complex solutions. And that came out of not just any single discipline, but through the combination of all disciplines. And I think it was that philosophy of the interdisciplinary nature of the program and of the interdisciplinary focus on urban issues that was unique to our program at UTA in any case then, and followed through from one degree or another, I think, until throughout the history of the program.
Its mission was to start educating graduate students in an interdisciplinary program to look at the problems of urban areas, metropolitan areas, ranging everything from housing to economic development to race relations to whatever was encompassed in that. But the focal point always was the entity was the urban area, the urban part of the city. Actually, that's what School of Urban Public Affairs, or the Institute of Urban Studies, is all about. For the first few years, was we all 3 of us, started with a premise that to really educate graduate students in the field of urban affairs, you need to get out in the community to do that. It wasn't something to sit around classrooms doing and that sort of thing. And we took that in the most expansive sense that you can find. For example, I taught environmental economics for a number of years, and I took some of our graduate students on field trips to strip mining operations over in East Texas and water purification systems, sanitary disposal systems, and things of that nature. So, Paul and Dill were doing similar things in their classes as well. So I think that was probably one of the most important things, was the outreach. It was getting out into the community, which at that time, you didn't find that much in academia. Academics just tended to teach their courses and stay on campus, and they really were out doing a lot of things. Of course, that got us in some trouble some of the time too, as with the Irving City Council persons who decided that Dill and I were communists. Dill and I thought it was kind of fun at the time. We didn't mind.
I think their strengths were their ability to, bring in different academic degrees, especially the online programs, especially those the certificates that was offered. I think that was, to me, that was really great, because a lot of students could come in and get those certificates and do well when they couldn't. There was no way they could pursue the actual master's degrees. So I thought that was a great move, and that was the strength of SUPA and the faculty and dean, was to bring in programs like that to help everybody. Their strengths were doing things like that, bringing in different programs to accommodate anyone and to make them soar, just make them. When I left, the certificate program was doing pretty good. The online MPA program was my biggest program. I had more students in the online program than it did in the regular MPA program. And so I think their strengths were really just bringing in different programs that would accommodate anyone.
Well, when I first got there was just a small cadre of folks. They were doing various kinds of research, and all under the leadership of the research director, who reported to Ed Overman, who had been hired from Rutgers University to be the director of the institute. And I think the reason for the excitement was that all of it at that time was focused on urban research. There was no faculty, and that was a good thing in some sense, because we were all working together, felt we all had a kinship that began to disappear when the faculty arrived, which occurred about a year later. So that was good. But the bad part, we had a sister institute for urban studies that was created at the University of Houston. And that institute only lasted about 3 to maybe 5 years. And the reason I believe it didn't make it, and the institute at UT Arlington did make it, was that there was no faculty. And without the faculty, it just simply didn't have the credibility. And the president at the University of Houston simply didn't support it at a critical time, and the appropriation was lost. We had a president who was very supportive, particularly after the faculty arrived, and we looked like a more traditional faculty, staff kind of institution. It made more sense, and I think that had a lot to do with our survival during those early years.
Major changes would have been that it became more technical, and I think a much larger component of it became an emphasis on research, so that the research program was extended. A lot more courses were introduced and researched. And that, of course, had something to do with the faculty who were being hired, because if you don't have faculty to teach research, then you're not going to have that much. But Richard Cole contributed to that, as did the aforementioned Rod Hissong. And, well, I'm sure there were others as well, but I can't think of who else right now. But I can't really say that the program, I don't think the program philosophically ever really changed. I think what happened is the technical approach to how you studied that and how you talked about that changed. But I think the philosophy behind School of Urban Public Affairs was always an interdisciplinary approach to examining urban problems. And so we continued to have this sort of tripartite division of sociology, political science, and economics. And research became a fourth. Well, research was always there, but it became a stronger component of that. But again, I don't think the philosophy ever really changed about what we're trying to do.
Well, a couple of, what occurs to me was, the addition of the professional programs which came along later, the city and regional planning program, I'm calling them now professional programs, the Master of Public Administration program that came along later, and the achievement of accreditation status of both of those programs was a big deal and a major accomplishment for us, for the School of Urban Public Affairs. And even though I called those professional programs, and I think most people were, even then, I think it's fair to say, we tried to create or recreate the interdisciplinary approach to how we taught and how we practiced urban planning, and how we taught and how we practiced public administration. And I think that those were unique. There are other planning programs in Texas, there are other public administration programs in Texas, but I think one of the really unique things about ours that distinguishes us from the others was and always has been the interdisciplinary nature of those programs. We tried to be true to our dual mission of community service, community outreach, and interdisciplinary approach to these complex issues.
Well, of course, once we began to see the minority input in terms of councils, the minority input in terms of positions of authority and planning and all levels of city and county government across the state, that we then moved to the next stage of trying to think about, and I forgot what the last retreat really kind of came up with, but we started talking about then our mission with regard to UTA. What did we bring to the table at UTA? And so some of the retreats that we had with Dr. Cole really addressed that question of and I think it was difficult with new faculty to explain to them that we were always vulnerable. So a great deal of our effort was to try to justify our position with the legislature to keep that going.
To me, it seemed like they were working very hard to expand the program itself and to pull in, students to make available a variety of degrees that they could pursue within the school, and to expand the institute from an institute, to a school. To me, that seemed to be what Dale Table, Paul Geisel, Jim Cornell's were all striving to do. It's just to make it a bigger and better institute?
Well, as I mentioned, in the early 1970s, 3 faculty members arrived, which really changed the chemistry of the Institute. Prior to that time, it had all been research projects. We had staffed an amazing commission that had been largely the result of efforts by Jim Ray, who was the research director, to prevail on the governor to appoint a very distinguished commission of people they were the umbrella group for these task forces that focused on all of the problem areas of state and local government. And the task forces each consist, again, of very distinguished people who were knowledgeable, who provided the knowledge base for the work.
We all decided that maybe after having all these programs, and now we have a PhD program, and I'm not sure of the details, but decision was made that we ask and meet with the president and provost, and of course the whole, I think Richard and Del Table and others have set the agenda and create the setting for it, that we ask officially university to that we are not to be called Institute of Urban Study anymore, but to be called school. As part of that, 2 events come to mind. One was that our meeting with president and provost. And I guess at that time, I don't know why I was involved, maybe I was the coordinator or director of the master program, but I was in the meeting, which was very collegial and friendly meeting. The president was Wendell Nederman, who was very friendly person, but they were both very casually took the thing, and eventually we were approved that we become school. And then, I don't know what's before that or after that, we had a one-day retreat, but I remember, I think, a park-type environment. I don't know what was one of the Arlington parks or wherever. And we had, lunch and food and things. And then as part of that, we were arguing and discussing that what to become the name of director, and even the whole discussion and the final votings was audio taped, I think. But eventually, regardless, we end up with the name of School of Urban and Public Affairs. So.
Yeah, but what I remember most about that revolved around this issue of how we were going to best reorganize ourselves. And what we decided to do was to have a retreat. And we had the retreat in Salado, of all places, outside of Austin, in part just to get away from the UTA, but in part also because it was close to Austin, and we could invite speakers there from Austin, from various departments, from the university there, and from various political folks. And so that's what we did. And our goal at that retreat was not to talk to each other, but to have all these people basically talk to us. And we had people from the Texas Department of Community Affairs, from the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, from some of the legislators that had originally supported our program, and so forth. And what we wanted to get from them was their view, really, of what they thought we were when we were created, and what they thought we were now, and what we could be going forward. So we listened. And for 2 days at Salado, we listened to what other folks thought we were and could be, and we came back, I think, a much more unified group than we had been before. And I think that that was the key, really, to breaking up these boxes that I mentioned earlier of the 3 divisions, and the key, really, to ultimately integrating our school into a unified faculty with unified missions.
I would say, if you really wanted to do the history of this thing, if you leave out the student contribution, you'd miss it all. That they were wonderful. And I would say for me personally, that that made me want to stay. My first thought was, this is going to be a one-year deal. You're going to get the heck out of here and get back to Chicago. But because of the students, I was so excited over the possibilities because they were going out into the field, and I had students, a couple of them, who would tell me, can we do that? And I said, do it. And they really were inspirations. So it was a great experience.
I wouldn't say that that our students are primarily mid-career students. I don't think that's exactly the right description, but I think they are students who had an undergraduate degree in something. The degree maybe was not working exactly the way they wanted it. For one reason or another, they came across our program in urban affairs. They liked what we did. They came here, they got the degree, and to one degree or another have been accomplished in whatever profession they pursued after that, whether it was a city manager or an urban planner or with a nonprofit agency or whatever. Have found, I think we're all proud of the successes that our students have achieved.
Billy Richards, she came, we did extensive interviews with the students before they came, and I said, now Billy, why are you coming to Urban Affairs? And she said, well, I want to become a banker. I said, well Billy, let's see now, you're over 40, female, black, and you've never worked. And her response, and this is God's truth, was, that's what I've got going for me. Now, what do you think my challengers will be? And I said, Billy, if you really believe that, we're going to make it. She got interested in housing. She did a study of neighborhood housing services. She created neighborhood housing services in the city of Dallas in the Love Field area. It was a huge success. And she retired as the president of Dallas First Federal Savings.
Okay, these are the Wymanettes. That was their choice, not mine. And I've had many other distinguished, enjoyable graduate assistants working on my grants. But these girls really made the machine go. And I recall them fondly. I think Joanna is still teaching at Arizona State. Trish, when last heard from, was teaching in New Zealand. She's back in the States. Ilana, I think, is a full-time mother, as is Angel, but both of these ladies found their way up to the new special transportation district in Denton for a while. But while they were all with me, we had many, many joyful times together. Two of them, Trish and Joanna, the PhD students, traveled abroad on our international grants. Trish worked in Ukraine and Joanna worked in Serbia. Beyond that, I have not kept track, obviously, of late closely as to what they're up to, but it brings back great memories. We, both abroad and in Arlington, had some very positive, joyful, intellectual times together.
To students, not because they're necessarily my favorite or anything like that, but because in many ways I think they typify the students that have come to us and the achievements that many have made. One of these is Linda Watson. Linda was a single mother when she came to us. She had a undergraduate degree in political science, but she came to us to work as a secretary. And as a secretary, she was probably in her mid to late 20s, I don't know exactly. But as a secretary to the program, she got to know us, of course, got to know the degree, and decided that the urban affairs degree, master's of urban affairs degree, was what she wanted and what she needed. So taking maybe one course a semester, maybe sometimes one course a year, she eventually, after a few years, graduated with a master's degree in urban affairs. She had an internship, I believe, one of her years with the Transportation Authority in Fort Worth, the what's it called, the T. And when she graduated, she assumed a full-time position with the Fort Worth Transportation Authority, worked there for several years, moved from there to the Corpus Christi Transportation Authority as an assistant manager or something like that. Moved from there after a few years to Orlando, Florida, where she assumed the position of the manager of the Orlando Public Transportation Authority. And after a few years there, moved to Austin, where she assumed the position of president and CEO of the Austin Public Transportation Authority. It's an authority, an agency with a $100 million budget. And here she, was a secretary in our program 25, 30 years ago, and now she's the president of a public program and managing a $100 million budget. So quite a success story, obviously. The other person I would mention is Chris Brenner. Chris came to us for the Master's of Urban Affairs degree. Liked it. She was a single mother too, as it turns out. She liked it and decided to stay on and get her PhD. So she got her PhD in public administration, public affairs. Her first job was at the University of Texas, El Paso, where she was an assistant professor. She moved from there to Rutgers, where she was promoted to associate professor with tenure in their urban affairs program, I think. And a few years later, moved from there to University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she now is the chair of the urban affairs program, public administration program, I think they call it there. So these are two. Not every student has graduated into tenure track faculty positions at major universities or is managing a $100 million project. But the success that those two have achieved is, I think, in many ways representative of the sorts of successes that our students can point to. And
my most memorable student was T. Bowman. He always just amazed me. Just sitting talking with him was always, fun. But to watch him do his job, with the city of Arlington and pursue a PhD, to me was most amazing. And he would come in my office and he would talk to me about, the problems he was having getting his dissertation through. And then one day he came in and he slammed on my desk and he said, "I'm going to sue." He spoke of his chair. And I said, "Well, you can't do that." So I said, "You can't do that." So I said, "You just need to calm down for a minute before you go into his office and just sit and vent with me." So what happened was that his chair had made changes once again to his dissertation, and that was just too much for T. Bowman to take at that particular time. So he was ready to sue his chair, the school, and I guess anyone else. So I kind of got him all calmed down before he went to see his chair, and I guess everything went well. I heard nothing else about the suit. But so he was one of my most memorable students. I had several, but he comes to mind. There was another one. Her name was Erin, and now she is employed by the city of Arlington as the assistant director of the courts. And she had little kids, and she just had a very hard time trying to juggle a master's in PA and her family. So to watch her get through that, to me was amazing. So those two come to mind. So
probably the most wonderful thing that can happen is they will tell you that you meant something to me. And they have no idea what that means for people like me. That is that what you want to say is, you meant something to me.
And we sort of got a reputation helping Southeast Dallas and Southeast Fort Worth neighborhoods. Probably Institute of Urban Study, along with the School of Urban and Public Affairs, between different faculty, we have done more than 20 studies just for near Southeast Fort Worth, which is a neighborhood just south of downtown.
Another one was another study, which turns out Professor Table and I were involved in with another student whose name was Ann Smith. And this was what we would have called back then a quality of life study, which was sort of popular then to do these sort of statistical analyses of geographical units like counties and cities and states and even nations and that sort of thing. And we did what we called a quality of life study of Texas cities, where we looked at all of the major population cities in Texas and trying to rank them on a number of criteria like education and public safety and housing and transportation and culture and all those sorts of things, and rank them from top to bottom. And the reason that I remember this so much, it was published, by the way, by the University of Texas at Austin Press, but that's not the reason that I remember it. The reason I remember it so vividly is because I learned then that whenever you do a ranking, nobody is happy except the person's ranked number one. And what you discover is that anybody and everybody who's not ranked number one, from second to whatever last, is unhappy about the study. And that was one of the very few times that I got a call from the president of the university, critical a little bit about our study, and letting me know that he had heard from a lot of people around the state that their city ought to have been ranked number one, should have been ranked number one, and is number one in the state of Texas. And he was hoping that the next time we did something like that, these cities would look better.
I think one of the biggest projects we had in some of the early years was when we applied for, it was under a grant program that at that time was administered by the division of the Department of Transportation, which I don't think really exists anymore. But it was a department that had to do with the development of alternatives to auto transportation. Del Table and I, somewhere along there, wrote a book together titled Political Economy of Urban Transportation. And that grew out of our work with this program, this federal program, and the various projects that were started under that. But the biggest thing, most important thing about that program is it paid some very generous student stipends. So we had a problem, one of the problems with any program, I guess, but as it began to grow was being able to pay your students. And graduate students, particularly when they got to the doctoral level, need to be paid more. But the grants and things are pretty tight. They don't allow for that much. So this particular grant, which we kept, I don't know, I want to say 5 or 6 years or something like that. And a lot of students came through under that grant program as well. And then we kind of developed, as a result of Dell's and my work in the area of transportation and the publication of the book, we developed more of that became one of the programs, or one of the foci of the school.
Well, the Dallas Alliance, probably in '76, simply because it changed everything for all of us. Winning the school desegregation case in Dallas which was a big one. And that also enabled you to move in different kinds of circles.
Were things I did with Bob Wagner during the early and the late 80s, the 80s and early 90s. Bob had come to the Institute back in the late 1970s after working at the COG for many years, and we did some training together, added to some training packages he was already using for planning commissioners. And then we got this opportunity through Dr. Wyman to do a training of trainers session for a group of corrections officers. And that was certainly an interesting, I'd never experienced to do that. Another one was similar to that. We had done a project for the city of Colleyville. It was a goal setting project done for, actually, the client in that case was a very well respected planning firm that didn't really know much about goal setting. They said, you do it and facilitate this task force, and then we'll use those goals as a basis for the comprehensive plan that we've been commissioned to develop for Colleyville. So we did that, very successful. A few projects that come to life. And there is one other one I want to mention. Through Dr. Wyman, he was able to engineer through the Department of State a partnership grant with a university, two of them, one of them in Serbia and one of them in Montenegro. And those were extremely interesting to travel there, to meet the people and work on not strategic planning so much, but what we were trying to do was help those countries set up a democratic system after having been under the communist yoke for so many years. They desperately wanted democratic tradition, but they didn't know how to do it. And a little piece of it was trying to train some of the staff in their local governments to take over positions like we call a city manager. In other words, to be the administrative head of a local government.
The other and the final memory that I would have, you mentioned the international thing. Professor Wyman for several years, 4 or 5 or 6 years, had grants from, I think it was the Department of Labor. I can't remember exactly, but it was a U.S. department. Had received grants, the purpose of which was to engage some academics and some public officials from former Soviet Union countries, like the Ukraine, to expose them to our concepts of public administration and what we saw as the democratic values and ways to administer public agencies. And part of what we did was some of our faculty and some of our students would go to the Ukraine, would meet with their faculty and their students and some of their public officials and talk about these things. And we would reciprocate by having some of their faculty and some of their public officials come to Arlington and meet with our faculty and meet with public administrators and so forth. And one of the things that they did for us and we did for them was to try to show them some of the particular events and cultural attractions and so forth that we had here. So on one of these occasions, we took a group of Ukrainians to the ballpark to see a baseball game. And of course, they had never seen a baseball game before. They had no idea what baseball was or how it was played or what the rules of the game were, that sort of thing. And as everybody here knows, baseball, unlike football or basketball or I guess most sports, has no time limit. So it's not timed in increment in whatever. It's not a 15-minute or a 30-minute thing. So this was one of those occasions when the first inning went forever. At least 45 minutes, maybe an hour. I don't remember exactly, but I know it was long. And here was these poor Ukrainians thinking that they were going to be sitting here in the ballpark, in the sun probably at that time, maybe 6, 7, even 8 hours, watching a game. They didn't even understand the game. They had no idea what a hit was, what a strike was, what a ball was, what an out was, or anything. So it was just, finally the game, of course, concluded in a normal time period and all that sort of stuff, and I think they enjoyed it. But it was really a very kind of funny experience, and also, an exposure to different ways of different cultures, different ways of looking at things. So I remember that. I think, by the way, that Dr. Wyman's grants and the activities that he was involved in spite of that little anecdote, were very successful, and I think that it helped a lot in forging some new international relationships that we would not have had before. It was a great program for us.
Then you get a Dr. Cole who comes in, and he just sort of instinctively knew what to do to get that group under control, and it just made all the difference. Didn't mean things were always rosy, but it was a totally different environment.
Without exception, we were able to assemble a quality group of faculty and staff, and I think that that's borne out in all the traditional ways that you measure those sorts of things, in terms of publications, in terms of scholarships, in terms of rankings, etc. We were able to bring together an exceptional group of faculty, people who were willing to come and actually take a chance. We were not a traditional program. We were not a Department of Political Science or Sociology or Economics, where the route to tenure and to permanent positions, were well defined. Ours was a bit of a risky program, and we were not traditional. And so the faculty who came were willing to come, were willing to take those risks, and were willing to perform.
Linda Gordon, she was kind of patient with us all, and she would just kind of suffer through it and so forth, but always with great spirit. And she was always on top of it. She would tell you, you haven't finished the paperwork for blah, blah. And that was very, very helpful and very supportive.
I had one professor who just kind of like refused to accept technology, and he still, everything he did, he still wrote it out and then brought it to me to type up, and then give it to him to change, and then he'd bring it back to me to make the changes, and then I'd give it back to him, and he'd make more changes, and then I'd have to do the change. It went on sometime for days. And so it one time got to the point that I took the latest round of changes to this one little letter, and I said, Dr. Wyman, if you give it back to me again, I'm throwing it away, because obviously it's not that important, and Lord knows I don't need the practice. So he laughed, and he signed it, and he gave it to me to mail.
To one degree or another, I think we stayed true, more or less, to our original mission of outreach to communities and to the interdisciplinary approach that we took. And I credit a great deal of that to those people who were there years before me. Ed Overman, who was the first director of the academic programs, and to the first staff members of what was called the Institute of Urban Studies, for creating that culture and that ethos that has continued through, to one degree or another, today, even through our professional programs and through our doctoral programs. I think we have, to one degree or another, stayed true to that, to those missions, and I think those are very, very distinctive. But overall, I think over the 50 years of the program, that we've moved from basically what was an experiment at that time to a highly credible, reputable, established program. And I was proud to be a part of that. I was proud to be a part of the school.
What really stood out for me, though, was being a part of, or the development of, and I take very little credit for that because there are so many other people who have been involved in it, of a program that became really quite well known nationally, and I think has had a great impact in a lot of areas.
I was just recently looking at the most recent rankings of the U.S. News and World Report of public affairs programs, and our program is today and continues to be ranked amongst the top 100 programs in the country, in the nation. And there must be 300 or 400 public administration programs, public affairs programs in the United States. And to be ranked amongst the top 100 is quite an honor. It's quite a compliment to our faculty, to our students, and to what they all have accomplished.
Despite disciplinary differences and personality differences and everything involved, I think on the whole that Institute of Urban Studies and SUPA both created atmospheres of collegiality and good feelings with other faculty members that I appreciated.
I mean, we were like a family, and that didn't mean we didn't have disagreements and at times when you just don't want to be with people and you got mad and so forth. We had all of that, and frustrated. But I would say overall, that I can't think of anybody that there were people I thought were shaky. But I think I had great respect for everybody.
The reason I enjoyed my work so much at SUPA was because, on the one hand, I had, what they call bosses. I was responsible working for faculty, but I never really looked at the faculty as my bosses. They were my friends. So it was like really wasn't going to work. I would always have a good time, chit-chat with my bosses, it was just like I was just being around my friends all day long.
I can't help but believe that the merging of disciplines, if you've got people in good faith who want to make it work, can lead to a healthier, more productive overall environment as people share ideas who would not normally be able to because they wouldn't be working together. Like it or not, a college is a silo. Like in government, they're silos. But if you can get enough disciplines built into that college, then you've got the potential for a much stronger, more diversified point of view.
Like any addition, we have now more programs, architecture with a lot of students, and landscape architecture. Any merger or any addition like that, if it is planned properly and thought of properly, can really be increase the strengths and open new avenues and potentials and things. But on the other hand, like any new thing, if you don't plan it good, if you don't direct it in the right direction, can be detrimental. So we gotta be very careful. I hope all of us together gonna be able to, of course, there has been some general thoughts, and through our new dean and maybe even the university that even implemented, but we have a lot to go. So depends on how this rest of the things gonna happen. We can be very successful and do a lot of good things.
It's time to revisit the state of urban Texas. And I would like to see us do that, and I think as a faculty, commentary and so forth, we might begin to see what our role was and where we go from here. I think an academic foundation requires that we have something to start with, and it's changed so.
Merge with SUPA will only make them better. I think it will only make their program stronger with excellent faculty that SUPA has, with the ideas that the faculty, can come up with to make a programs or a department better, will only strengthen campus. So it can only get better.
I think there's a lot to be said for that marriage, particularly with the interaction with our planning faculty.
I'm very positive about the move. I think it's a very good thing for us, for our program. I think it's a good thing for architecture as well, but somebody else has to speak to that. I think it's a very good thing. I like the building that we're in. I think it's good to be part of a bigger program at UTA. More faculty, more exciting things going on, more students, more interaction.